Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. A warm welcome to the Crawford School Oration. My name is Tom Compass. I'm the director of the Crawford School here in the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. Let me start first by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land that we meet on here today, and whose cultures, among the oldest living cultures in the history of the world, we celebrate. Let me just start with a few thank yous. First, deep thanks to the national sponsors of the Joseph Stiglitz tour here in Australia, PricewaterhouseCoopers and Qantas. For this event, this particular event, thanks to the Economic Society of Australia for allowing the Crawford School to host Joseph Stiglitz, something that I can say on behalf of my colleagues I'm very proud of. We are very proud of. The president of the ESA, Bruce Chapman, is here on stage, and he'll have a bit of a thank you for Joseph Stiglitz at the end of the presentation. Also, I want to thank the Trevor Swan Distinguished Lectureship Series for its financial support. The Crawford School is ANU's policy school, public policy school. We care deeply about high-quality education, research, and policy impact. We care about public engagement. And this lecture is a good example of that. It's part of our mission. The purpose of the Crawford School is leading public policy for a better world. And no one embodies that spirit, that purpose, leading public policy for a better world, than tonight's speaker, Joseph Stiglitz. To introduce that speaker, it's my pleasure. Please welcome the former director of the Crawford School, the much-loved former director of the Crawford School, now the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific, Professor Andrew McIntyre.
Thanks, Tom. Joseph Stiglitz will be known to the great majority of people here as winner of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on asymmetric information and the implications of this for markets. Note also that he was the lead author of the 1995 report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Nobel Prizes single people out as being pretty extraordinary individuals. But there's much more about this guy that marks him out as just truly extraordinary, beyond the Nobel Awards. Be no surprise to people that to learn that he earned his PhD from one of the very finest stables for economists, MIT. But get this, 3 years later, at the age of 27, he was winning full professor at Yale. 3 years. And just a short time after that, he was winning the John Bates Clark Prize that's handed out by the AEA to the best economist, or to the economist making the most significant contribution under the age of 40. He's currently at Columbia, but he's held appointments at many of the most distinguished universities in the world. He was chairman of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. He was chief economist and then senior vice president at the World Bank. He was chair of the UN's Commission of Experts on Reform of the International Financial and Monetary System. And the list goes on and on and on. As you'd expect, he's published extraordinary pieces of scholarship in all the journals that the best economists salivate over, and most of the rest of us can't read. But no less importantly, he's published very widely beyond journals of that sort. At last count, his work had been translated into at least 35 languages. If you go back over the list of all the recipients of the Nobel Prize in economics over the years, there's very, very few who have moved not just the economics profession, not just the economics literature, but the wider public debate, indeed the global public debate, in the way that Joseph Stiglitz has. So forget about what the New York Times has to say about Joseph Stiglitz. Forget about what the Financial Times has to say, the Economist, the Wall Street Journal. Here's the real point. People magazine says he's a poster boy. Ladies and gentlemen, Joseph Stiglitz.
Well, it's a real pleasure, and thank you very much for that introduction. I hope I live up to it. Let me begin. The title of the talk was Road to Ruin, Financial Instability in the Global Economy. I thought maybe I should spend a minute talking about the road to ruin itself, because here in Australia, your major contribution to the global financial crisis was the acronym GFC. Which I think is an important contribution, but I don't think you fully appreciate how bad things are in other parts of the world, in the United States and in Europe. It's now been more than 3 years since America's real estate bubble broke in the beginning of 2007. It's been almost 3 years since our recession began at the end of 2007. Things are still not in very good shape. And just to give you a few data that suggest how bad things are, currently about 1 out of 6 Americans, more than 1 out of 6 Americans who would like a full-time job can't get one. And that's a real picture of an economy not performing the way it's supposed to be performing. Increasingly, a large fraction of these unemployed have been unemployed for a long time. Historically, when Americans lost their job, it'd be for a short period of time, and we had an unemployment insurance system that provides them 6 months of unemployment benefits, but within that 6 months, they get another job and they go back to work. But now, for the first time in our history, since the data has been collected, almost 50% of the people who are unemployed now have been unemployed for more than 6 months. And that means they've used up their savings accounts, and if historical data is of any relevance, individuals who've been unemployed for this duration, when they finally get a job, it will be at substantially lower wages, and their lifetime prospects are much worse. When you look at the unemployment rate in particular socioeconomic groups, things are even worse. And you look at particular locations. And the United States is a large country, but and so the number that I gave, a little over 1 out of 6 who would like a full-time job can't get one, is an average. But in particular areas in Michigan and California, the numbers are much larger. So just to give you one example, among Afro-American youth now, the unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate that does not include discouraged workers, does not include people who've given up looking for a job, because you're not called unemployed if you're not actively seeking a job. That official unemployment rate is now close to 50%. Now, the only thing that makes us feel good is that things in Europe are worse. So that the average official unemployment rate in Spain now is 20%, And among Spanish youth, and this is a much broader definition of Spanish youth, the unemployment rate is between 40 and 50%. It's been that way for a couple years. So you can imagine, for those of you who are students, your prospect when you graduate from school is to be unemployed as long as your eye can see. It's not a very strong motivating factor. So that's only one side of the road to ruin that describes many countries in Europe and in the United States. Another aspect is the housing market. It was the housing market where the economic downturn began in the United States, and things still are not in good shape. Housing prices have fallen about a third. The good news is they've stopped falling, or not, they will level it off, but there is no sign that they will be recovering anytime soon, and much of what the stabilization itself was a result of massive government intervention. To the point today, the Federal Reserve Board, our central bank, owns $1.2 trillion of mortgages. The private sector is not interested in buying mortgages. And so the entire housing market in the United States is being supported today by the government. Even with that, however, as I say, millions of Americans are losing their home. And so we have on our hands not only an economic problem, we have a social problem. 2 million, roughly almost 2 million lost their homes in 2008, 2 million in 2009, and we expect this year somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million to lose their homes. So things are not getting better. In other areas, like commercial real estate, the problems are just becoming evident. In residential real estate, 1/4 of all Americans who have a mortgage owe more on the mortgage than the value of their home. So they used to think of their home as their savings account, what will provide for their retirement, for the education of their children. And now the home that used to be an asset has all of a sudden become a liability. But in commercial real estate, the problem is even worse. It's about 50% of the properties that are underwater. And of course, this all becomes interrelated in a vicious circle. One of the things that marked America was a highly mobile labor market. People moved from one part of the country to another, wherever the jobs were. But we also have a real estate market, which is basically owner-occupied homes. But that means when you move, you sell your home and you buy another home. But today, with so many homes underwater, when you sell your home, you have nothing with which to buy another home. So in fact, there is increasing worry that the mobility of America's labor market, one of our defining characteristics, will be weakened as a result, at least for an extended period of time. The mortgage market also is interacting with job creation, and another example of a vicious downward spiral. Most small businesses, and small businesses are the source of job creation in most economies, most small businesses are financed by asset-backed loans based on collateral. And the collateral that most use is real estate. And with real estate down 30, 40%, the loans that they can get, even if the banks were willing to lend, are that much smaller. And that means they not only can't they expand, but they're contracting. Meanwhile, while we threw money at the banks in the most extravagant bailout in the history of the planet, it didn't do what it was supposed to do. The reason both President Bush and Obama said that we were throwing money at the banks was a belief in trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics has never worked, and it didn't work this time. The belief was that by throwing all this money at the banks would lend the money on, and that would lead to a revival of the economy. But we, quote, trusted the banks. Why is unbelievable. After their record, you would have thought somebody would have learned a lesson. When the IMF gives money to countries like in East Asia, they put all kinds of conditions. We didn't put any conditions on the banks. If economics has if there's any principle the economists agree on, it's incentives matter. And you looked at the incentives of the bankers and you realized what they would do with the money. As we gave them the money, they paid out the money in bonuses and in dividends. They had no incentive to lend, and they didn't lend. And so today, 2 years after the crisis began, the flow of credit, the amount of outstanding credit, is markedly below what it was 2 years ago. And no wonder our economy isn't functioning. While we threw money at the big banks that were proud of the fact that they had stopped being in what they call the storage business, they moved on to what they call the moving business. They moved out of old-style lending. That was so early 19th century, 20th century, they moved on to trading and speculation. So while we bailed out the big banks that were engaged in that kind of trading and speculation, we let the smaller and medium-sized banks that were actually involved in credit creation, we let those go bankrupt. So 140 banks went bankrupt in the United States last year, and the number that are expected to go bankrupt this year is considerably larger. So the result of this, of course, is when we talk about a bank going bankrupt, that's the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot of other banks that are near that point, and they're, of course, not lending. So to me, as I look at what is going on in the United States, you see the recent news that the economic recovery is dampening. It's not a surprise. It would have been a surprise if we had continued in the strong growth that we had at the end of 2009. And the story of that growth was very simple. Firms had over-depleted their inventories. They had to rebuild their inventories, and so there was a restocking that occurred, and that gave a little bit of support to the economy. And at the same time, there was a lot of support from government programs that helped support the economy. But those programs are now beginning the phasing out, and that is going to mean the economy is getting weaker, and we're going back to what I think was predictable, a situation of a very weak economy, likely to be weak for an extended period of time. Well, I don't want to dwell on that too much. I just want to give you the picture of the rosy scenario that's in the rest of the world. One more point I should mention, because it will be relevant to what I'll say in a few minutes. As I said, the one thing that gives us a little bit of good feeling is that things in Europe are worse. And the particular aspect, I talked about the unemployment, the other aspect where things have gotten worse in Europe is the financial crises. Greece is the most obvious example, but there are a number of other countries that in which there are high levels of anxieties, worries that they will be attacked. To put it very briefly, the banks, after having been rescued by governments, decided to bite the hands that fed them. And they started to say, look at all the debt that you've accumulated. Of course, the reason they had the debt was because they had to save the banks and they had to rescue the economies that had weakened because of their failures of the financial system. Some of the countries, like Greece, had bad, you might say, excessive debt in the years before the crisis. But that's not true of all. Spain, for instance, is one of the countries that's talked about as being a potential candidate for a problem. Before the crisis, it had a surplus. So it wasn't as if it had been engaged in fiscal profligacy, but it did buy into the economic philosophy that you shouldn't intervene in the market too much. So the result of that was economic policy makers allowed a real estate bubble to grow in Spain, as it did in the United States, as it did in the UK, and a number of other countries. And it was perfectly clear that when that bubble broke, there would be severe economic consequences for Spain, and that has been the case. So the consequence of this the consequence of the fear of a speculative attack is that even the countries that so far have not had any speculative attack are engaging in a policy of fiscal austerity. Now, for more than 75 years, there's been a debate about between two alternative approaches to what you do when an economy gets into a crisis. So what's interesting is the same ideas get debated over and over again. One view that I call the Hooverite view in honor of Herbert Hoover, who was the distinguished president of the United States at the time of the stock market crash, and whose economic policies responding to that led to the Great Depression. You can see I don't really think he did the right thing. What he did is he saw whenever an economy goes into a downturn, tax revenues go down, expenditures like for welfare programs today, for unemployment, for all kinds of expenditures go up. And the result is that when economies go into a downturn, there's an increase in deficit. In fact, most of the increases in the deficits today in the advanced industrial countries are not from stimulus measures. They're from the automatic stabilizers, the fact that tax revenues go down more than 3/4 are a result of these automatic stabilizers and not a result of the stimulus measures. Well, so one school of thought says, seeing these deficits, you ought to cut back expenditures, maybe raise taxes, get rid of the deficit. That will restore confidence, and with confidence, investment will return, and the economy will start to grow. The other view is attributed, you might say, it was argued most forcefully by Keynes, and interestingly, it's just the opposite. It says the problem is a lack of aggregate demand. That's why the economy is weak. We have to stimulate, the markets are not working well. We have to stimulate aggregate demand by increasing expenditure. Yes, that will, in the short run, increase the deficit, but if we spend the money on high-power investments, investments that even yield moderate returns of 5 or 6%, then you grow the economy in the short run from the stimulus, from the multiplier, and you grow the economy in the long run from the investment, and that the result of that will be that confidence will be restored and that the deficit will be actually lower. The debt will be lower in the long run. So we have two quite different views of what you should do. Over the 75 years in which this debate has been going on, we've had lots of experiments. The last set of experiments was given to us by the IMF in East Asia, and it tried the experiment in Argentina and a number of other countries. Economists love experiments. We can't usually do experiments like chemists and physicists can do, but we have these experiments where the IMF comes in to a country and tries a particular policy, and we can see what happens. It gives us a lot of data. As I say, it's wonderful for economists, but all of these experiments have been a disaster for the countries. So they tried the Hooverite experiment, as if we needed another one after 1929. And lo and behold, what have we discovered? That confidence fairy that those financial markets predict will happen when the deficit gets down never seemed to appear. The economy never seems to be restored. Instead, you get bankruptcy after bankruptcy. Investors don't like to go into an economy going into a deep recession or depression. The IMF really succeeded in Indonesia, where they got the unemployment rate up to 40% in the island of Java. So we know which of these two approaches will work. And I've talked about this anecdotally, but there's a huge amount of statistical evidence, a huge amount of theoretical bases for these perspectives. So the implication of this should be very, very clear. That the measures that many of the European countries are taking today is partly a road to ruin. This austerity will weaken their economy. If one country did it, if Greece alone does it, it has very limited effect. Greece is a small country of 10, 11 million people. But if all of Europe does this, it will have global ramifications. If Europe and the United States does it, it will be even worse. So while we are, as I said before, 3 years, 2 years, depending how you define it, into this current economic downturn, there are prospects of a much longer economic downturn and things getting worse if current policy frameworks that are being discussed in Europe are actually executed. Well, I want to talk now a little bit about some of the broader lessons, broader implications. First about financial instability, and then putting this into the global context. I've already hinted at several of these, but I want to bring these together. The first point I want to raise is that, in fact, instability has marked market economies since the beginning of capitalism, of modern capitalism. There have only been a period of about 35 years in this long history of capitalism when there were not repeated financial crises. And that was the short period after the Great Depression, when the United States and most other countries adopted strong financial regulations. We passed the Glass-Steagall Act that separated commercial and investment banks. We created the Securities and Exchange Commission. We passed a whole series of laws to try to regulate the financial sector. Prior to that, there were repeated financial crises. But because the regulations worked and stopped us from having crises, some people made the wrong inference. They said, we don't need regulation. Look, we don't have any crises anymore. We've gotten so much smarter. So they attributed it to the advances in our knowledge, the fact that we didn't have crises. And beginning with Thatcher and Reagan, a process not only of stripping away regulations began, but a process of not adopting new regulations to respond to the changing global marketplace. So in the late 90s, the United States repealed Glass-Steagall, which separated the commercial and investment banks. And then in one of the strangest twists of history, after the New York Fed orchestrated a bailout of long-term capital management. Long-term capital management, for those of you who don't remember, was a single hedge fund with an exposure of about $1.5 trillion whose demise threatened to bring down the entire global economy as a result of its speculation on derivatives. And you would have thought after that experience that people looking at that said, we have to regulate derivatives. We have to do something about it. And what was the response of our geniuses in our financial markets? We have to pass a law to make sure that the regulators don't touch these things. Because it was obvious that regulators seeing this said that something ought to be done. And the head of the CFTC, the regulatory body who was responsible, said, we have to do something. But the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, the head of our Federal Reserve, ganged up on her and succeeded in getting a law passed saying that regulators could not regulate derivatives. It wasn't clear whether derivatives should be viewed as gambling products or as insurance products. But they say you can't be regulated as a gambling product, can't be regulated as an insurance product, can't be regulated as a financial product. And from then, things just got worse. Just to give you a feeling about how what we're talking about here, these derivatives led to the collapse of AIG, which required a U.S. government bailout. The bailout of this one firm cost $180 billion. Now, for those of you who don't know economics very well, $180 billion is a lot of money. I felt very intensely on the subject because when I had been chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, we had a lot of important programs that would have, I think, made a very big difference for our country, for our growth, for equity, for helping some of the poorest people, for helping our aged. But every one of our ideas was stymied because we couldn't afford it. And what we were talking about was a few $billion a year. Shortly before President Bush bailed out AIG, he had vetoed a health insurance program for poor children. In the United States, if you're poor, you're not entitled, and you may be left without health care. We have basically a private health care system. The view was that children shouldn't depend on the wealth of their parents. After all, they didn't choose their parents. The conservative view was, well, they should have done a better job choosing parents that were wealthier. The other side said, well, you can't quite do things that way. Well, anyway, Congress passed a bill providing health care insurance for poor children. And the view was that if you didn't have health care, they might have scars for life and interfere with the productivity. It was not just a question of equity, it was a question of efficiency, of productivity, making sure you didn't wind up with people that might be a lifetime burden. But he vetoed that bill, which would have cost a few $1 billion a year, saying we couldn't afford it. And yet, just a few weeks later, he found $180 billion for AIG. It says something about our values. It says something about the way our economic system works. Well, we didn't, as I said, we didn't regulate. We not only did we deregulate, we didn't pass these new regulations for these new financial instruments. And finally, we appointed regulators who didn't believe in regulation. And not surprisingly, if you have regulators who don't believe in regulation, you're not going to get good regulation. It was deliberate, let me make it clear. We had a chairman of our Federal Reserve Board, Paul Volcker, in the late 70s, early 80s, had brought down inflation from a double-digit level down to 3-4%. Normally, central bankers who had accomplished something like that would have been given a Presidential Medal of Honor, would have been feted, would have been reappointed. But he was fired by President Reagan. Why? Because he understood that you needed regulation, you needed something like a separation of commercial banks from investment banks, and he wasn't going to support Reagan's attempt to deregulate. And so he presided and contributed to, Alan Greenspan contributed to, he was replaced by Alan Greenspan. But we shouldn't focus on a single individual, because it would have been the case he would have found lots of other people with that mindset, and that mindset was what led to the problems. Well, as I said, instability has marked the market economy, except in this short period of where we had strong regulations. There actually is an important issue in economic theory about whether markets, private markets on their own, are stable and efficient. Probably the most influential idea in economics is that of Adam Smith. His theorem was called the invisible hand theorem, which says that the pursuit of self-interest by individuals and firms leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. And it is that theorem which really provides a lot of the basis of our belief in a market economy. It took more than 175 years after Adam Smith enunciated this idea in Wealth of Nations in 1776 for the economics profession to be able to prove the conditions under which it was true. I played a little bit of role in that, in asking a simple question: was it true when information was imperfect, information was asymmetric, when risk markets were incomplete, which they always are? And the answer we got was very striking. What we showed is that the reason that the invisible hand often seems invisible is that it's not there. That is to say that the markets are in general not efficient. There are all kinds of distortions. And in some areas where information is imperfect, those distortions are very important. And in finance, information is at the center of finance, and so we shouldn't be surprised that market failures of this type, are manifest in that sector. There are a whole set of other analytic results that I don't have time to go through today, but that relate to the stability of the economic system, the ability when it gets shocked to restore quickly to its equilibrium, ability to create cycles. But as anybody who's looked, as I said before, at the history of capitalism has seen that it's been characterized by bubbles that burst. This crisis, in that sense, is very much like so many other crises we have. The only difference is that we invented a few new financial terms: CDO, CDO squared, all kinds of acronyms. But what is interesting, if you look at the history of the discussion of financial crises, many of them have actually been marked by financial innovations. Most of them marked by another aspect which is very similar to the current one: an enormous amount of hubris. Those going through this period say, oh yes, we understand that there were bubbles in the past, but we live in a new era where we're so much smarter than those who went before us. So yes, we understood that they made mistakes, but we're different. And you have people like Alan Greenspan announcing the new economy, which is the end of the business cycle. When he was asked whether there was a bubble, his reply was, no, just a little froth. And why could he say that so confidently? Because he was very confident that markets would not lead to that kind of inefficiency that is associated with a bubble. Well, there's a long, I could go on a long discussion about why it is so surprising that he is so surprised that markets behaved so badly. But one aspect that I should just mention is that 21st century and late 20th century capitalism is markedly different from 19th century capitalism, which is the kind of capitalism that many of us have in mind when we think about how the market economy operates. 19th century capitalism, you had a guy who owns his own firm, makes a decision. If he makes a mistake, he bears the consequence. 21st and late 20th century capitalism, there's been a separation between ownership and control. There are what we call agency problems. The person, the bankers were making very high returns even if the shareholders and the bondholders did very badly. And what makes it even worse is that there's a whole chain of what we call agency problems, because the people investing in these financial products were typically not investing their own money, but were increasingly institutional investors investing on behalf of others. So you have a whole chain where the consequences of a mistake are borne by other people. When you have these kinds of problems, the way the economy functions can be markedly different from the way that is typically described in 19th century economics. You saw that so clearly, for instance, in the incentive structures. Our banks were very proud about their incentive structures. They thought this was one of the great achievements. But you look at those incentive structures, at least I looked at those incentive structures, and I said, again, if incentives matter, and it's the one thing economists agree on, these are incentives for short-sighted behavior and excessive risk-taking. And way before the crisis, I was worried. If we didn't have a crisis, we would have to rewrite our textbooks. The silver lining on this crisis is that we don't have to write our textbooks. It turns out that if you give bad incentives, people behave badly. If you don't have good regulation to stop them from doing that. Well, all that I've said so far would be true if everybody had were rational. And as remarkable as it may seem to those of you who are not economists, the standard model in economics assumes a high degree of rationality. In fact, the one thing I could say about economists' devotion to those models is that they are irrationally committed to models of rationality. That, in fact, the evidence is overwhelming, not only in our personal life, but in economic life, that people behave very irrationally. And if you look, I could go on. I have a whole lecture where I go through this crisis in detail about 20 instances of deep, profound, first-order irrationalities on the part of markets. So you cannot, having looked at this crisis, still believe in rational markets. The point I wanted to make is everything I've said about the failures are true even if everybody acted rationally. But if you have markets with irrational exuberance or irrational pessimism, things could be even worse. So that's why it is so important for there to be regulations to stop this kind of excessive volatility that has been a feature of capitalism, as I say, since the beginning. I want to turn now to the third aspect of the title of the talk, which is the global economy. The theory was that globalization and diversification would lead to a new era of stability. The argument was a very, very simple one, that by spreading risk out, you were going to reduce the impact of risk, and that would make the economy much more stable. And that was one of the reasons that people like Greenspan were not worried. They said, yes, the economy has a lot of risk, but we've succeeded in spreading it out, and that has made the system more stable. Well, it didn't work out that way. And it is a puzzle, an analytic puzzle, an empirical puzzle, why that is the case. And I want to suggest this afternoon a couple of hypotheses why that was the case. Some of it is very simple. I talked before about the irrationality of the markets. One aspect of the irrationality of the markets is that some people in the markets had more confidence in the products that they were creating that they should have. And so rather than selling it, they kept it on their own books. So the banks had more of this stuff than they should have had. They didn't diversify as they should have. They were irrationally, as I said, exuberant. A second aspect of it is, you might say, extraordinary dishonesty. One of the things that is associated with the distortionary incentive structures that I mentioned before was that many corporations pay their CEOs by stock options. And when you get paid by stock options, you have a strong incentive to try to get the value of your stock up. Now, it's very hard to actually come up in a competitive world with better ideas, ways of making more money in an honest way. But so our banks and our other firms figured out other ways of doing it, which is creative accounting. You can make yourself look as if you were doing better. That was much easier than actually doing better. And so they came up with some really very clever things. I have to give them credit for it. Our business schools helped them. And the basic principle is to make sure that you move losses, risk off your balance sheet and profits onto your balance sheet. So what they did would be engage in producing these securities. These securities, complex securities, very complex securities. They believed in financial alchemy. I don't know if you remember medieval alchemy, where you took lead and you converted it to gold. You can't do it, for those of you who are chemists. Well, they tried something that is a little bit equivalent. They took F-rated subprime mortgages and tried to convert them into A-rated securities that are safe enough to be held by a pension fund. So they did some hocus pocus, but the main part of it was they created these complicated securities and they sell off different tranches, but there'd always be a part of it that nobody would want to buy. Well, they could book the fees for creating these financial products. They could book those on the balance sheet, and they can keep this little junk that they had at the end that they couldn't sell to anybody off the balance sheet. And it looked very good. Their profits were very high. Profits in the financial sector of the United States were 40% of all corporate profits. So they looked like they were doing fantastic. But of course, it was all a sham. They were recording fees and taking the risks off the balance sheet. So when the crisis came, they had to own up to what was going on. The banks themselves didn't all know how bad they had managed their own risk. One of the reasons we had a freeze of the credit market globally is the banks knew that they didn't know their own balance sheet, and therefore they knew that they couldn't know that of anybody else. They knew that they couldn't trust themselves, let alone trust anybody else. And in that environment, credit stops. And that's why we got a credit freeze. I mean, just as an aside, why was September 15th so important when the U.S. government refused to bail out Lehman Brothers? Because everybody had assumed up to that point, underlying every bank was the U.S. government. And when U.S. government says, not so sure, the markets froze. So it wasn't just the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, it was the announcement that you can't rely on the U.S. government that made the financial sectors freeze. So one of the reasons that things were not moved off balance sheet was this kind of scam, this bad accounting that they were engaged in. There was a third reason, which is that diversification led to more risk-taking. In another way of putting it, it led to more bad lending. You can see that very clearly. In the old days, when banks originated a mortgage, they would lend to somebody. They knew they had to do a good job because if the mortgage didn't work out, they bore the consequence. Now, in this new model with securitization, where you could sell it all over the world, that was based on a new theory, on an old theory, which is called the greater fool theory. And globalization had opened up a global marketplace for fools. And our banks weren't very good at creating good products, but they were very good at marketing and finding the fools all over the world. When I give this lectures in Europe, I always thank the audience for having bought so many of our toxic mortgages. The Europeans bought about 40% of them. And if they hadn't, the downturn in the United States would have been all the worse. So we are very thankful to Europeans for having bought those mortgages. We're thankful to the regulators in Europe for opening up their market to our toxic products. If they hadn't done that, we would have had, again, a hard time. So they worked together. Our markets knew that many people in Europe didn't even understand the kinds of mortgages, the non-recourse mortgages that were endemic to America. They used to call the people buying them, they referred to them as the Dusseldorfs. So the result of this was that actually diversification actually led to a deterioration of the quality of what was being produced. The interesting point here was modeling. The credit rating agencies created models in which they tried to predict the risk associated with a default if you had a pool of mortgages. Now, whenever you do empirical modeling like that, you have to use data. And where do you get the data from? Now, here they had a real intellectual problem, and they were faced with, you might say, an intellectual inconsistency. They believed that they had created new products that had changed the world. That's why they decided that they deserved so much money. But if they changed the world, the data from the world before they had changed it would no longer be necessarily relevant in forecasting what the future would be like. So if you really had changed the world, how could you use data for the previous 10 years or 15 years to predict what will happen in the next 10 or 15 years? Well, in fact, they had changed the world for the worse. When you invent products like liar loans, 100% mortgages, variable rate mortgages, a whole set of financial products that were different, riskier than those that had been created before, the probability of default was much higher, but their models didn't take into account. I had lectured at Columbia and other places about securitization, and we always begin the first lecture talking about the advantages of securitization and diversification. The second lecture is about the risks associated with the moral hazard problem, the problems I just discussed. But the students are so enthusiastic after the first lecture that they run down to Wall Street to make money and don't listen to the second and third lecture. Well, the third lecture was about correlation. They believed that there would never be a downturn in all of the economy at the same time, in the housing market in the economy at the same time. But the fact is that there are macroeconomic shocks. If interest rates go up, all housing markets will be depressed throughout the country. We have a national interest rate, a financial market. In fact, we have a global financial market. So their assumptions about correlation were simply wrong. And so that's why it was that when we went into the crisis, all almost all of the markets went down and the products did so badly. Well, there are a number of other aspects of why this didn't work. Let me mention just one more, a little bit technical, but I think it's of some interest. Those who advocate globalization, global integration, always talk about the advantages of diversification, that you can spread risks around. But since we entered this era of global financial integration, the world has been marked by large numbers of crises. In the last 25, 30, 35 years, we've had over 100 crises. What's different about this is only that it's the largest and it's centered in advanced industrial countries rather than in developing countries. But once a crisis strikes, the vocabulary changes. The vocabulary changes to contagion. We worry about contagion. The reason we bailed out, the argument for bailing out Indonesia or Thailand or Korea was that if we don't do that, there will be contagion to other countries. Well, what does the word contagion mean? A contagion is like, it's a word from epidemiology. It's a disease that goes from one to another. Well, what do you do with diseases? Typically, when you have a very contagious disease, you have quarantine. And what does that say? You don't want integration. The more integrated, the more the disease spreads around. So we've had, in a sense, two models in our mind. One model talks about the virtue, which we do when we're pushing globalization, when we're pushing integration, and the other one talks about the disadvantage that we talk about when we're trying to get a rescue package to save a country. But in fact, any coherent model of the advantages and disadvantages of integration has to recognize that there will be crises and that when you have a more integrated economy, the consequence of a crisis in one part of the system will spread to others. It's part of the cost of integration. And so optimal integration has to take this into account. An obvious example, analogy, is electric grids. When we integrate electric grids, we save on capacity. You get a more efficient electric utilization of capacity. But when we integrated grids, in the United States, we created a large electric grid. What was the consequence? A failure in one little town in Ohio brought down the whole electric system in the East Coast. So those in other areas have realized that there are costs and benefits of integration, and to deal with that, they don't walk away from integration, but they put in things like circuit breakers. So it's not a blind faith in integration. It says integration works, but we have to have safety valve. We have to have circuit breakers. We have to do something, because if we don't, we can get a disease spreading from one country to another. Well, for those of you who are economists, what this translates into is the models that economists have used have always made very strong mathematical assumptions about concavity. And in those kind of world, there's only benefits from risk distribution. It always just spreads risk. But in the real world, there are all kinds of convexities. And in a world where there's convexities, risk sharing can lead to lower performance. It can lead to the kinds of spreading of a disease from one place to another. So our mathematical models, the prevalent mathematical models, as in so many other examples I've given, have been fundamentally flawed and led us to make flawed conclusions. There's one more final point I want to make, which has to do with globalization, the political economy of globalization. Globalization has meant that countries have been competing with each other. And they've been competing for financial markets as well as for other products. The unfortunate thing is, in the area of financial markets, there's been what might be called a Gresham's law, a race to the bottom. And it's been very clear. One country will say, our regulators say, we have to lower our standards because if we don't, the financial firms will move somewhere else. This race was won by Iceland. But a lot of people paid a very high price for Iceland's victory. The Icelandic people, of course, paid the highest price. I think we should learn from that example and say this is a race that we may not want to win. Now, the G20 has recognized that it's important to get coordination in regulation. They're worried about the race to the bottom, but they're also worried about the problem of circumvention, of regulatory arbitrage, that if you don't have at least harmonized regulations, money will flow around to where it is least well regulated. It would be good if we could get a harmonized regulatory system, and perhaps eventually we will. But we can actually protect ourselves. We can actually go a long way even without an international agreement. After before in the month before 9/11, the OECD had proposed an agreement on eliminating bank secrecy. Bank secrecy is being used as a vehicle for hiding all kinds of unsavory transactions. I should tell a little story about this. I once, a few years ago, gave a talk at one of the famous bank offshore banks centers, and I don't know why they invited me, but I think it was the kind of penance people like to listen to somebody lecture them, and they feel good after. It's sort of like doing a confession. So I gave my sermon about how bad bank secrecy was, and how bad it was, particularly for developing countries, because it facilitates all this corrupt money going from Africa to and other places in developing world, Latin America, into the safe havens, encourages corruption. And after the seminar, after the lecture, a couple of the bankers came up to me and said, "You don't understand our country. We don't do money laundering. We don't do corruption. We don't do drugs, narcotics. We just do tax evasion." So I asked him, "How do you know?" And he says, "Because we asked them." Well, the month before 9/11, the OECD proposed to do something about bank secrecy, and President Bush, Secretary, Treasury, vetoed the initiative. He said, well, you know, secrecy is a dimension in which firms can compete. Then, of course, we discovered in 9/11 that one of the uses to which bank secrecy was being used was to finance terrorism. And then Bush changed his mind, but only for terrorism. It's okay to have narcotics and all those other things. But the point of telling the story is that we succeeded in shutting down the use of bank secrecy for purposes of terrorism, and we could shut it down for any of these other purposes if we wanted to. And we are now making a resolve to do it in the international community for tax evasion. but we are leaving out corruption, we're leaving out money laundering, all kinds of other things. It's only focusing on the concerns of the Western European countries, the United States, the countries that are their concerns, not on the broader global concerns. So we can do something if we want to. The problem is that the G20, each of the countries in the G20 is currently focusing on the question, what kind of regulatory system will advantage my financial institution and disadvantage my rivals? So if you look at the agenda, each of the countries has an agenda and they don't mesh very well. Meanwhile, the banks were loving this because their view was this is the kind of paralysis that will mean that we won't get regulated. And I think that eventually, by last spring, led to a new tone where country after country came to the realization that it is their responsibility to protect their financial markets, their economy, their citizens, first and foremost. That it's the responsibility of each country to do this. And so what we are beginning to see is each country adopting its own regulation. We will then have to harmonize these. We will be interfering, and in fact, we will be undermining some aspects of global financial market integration. But I think that price is a price worth paying for, because the alternative is the kind of instability that we've seen and seen repeatedly. So just to conclude, I think the crisis has brought home a large number of lessons about economics, about finance. The silver lining in this particular cloud is that if we learn those lessons, then hopefully we'll be protected. Not that we will protect ourselves from ever having a crisis, but I think we can succeed in making crises less frequent, less deep, and less costly. And that, I hope, is the lesson, the opportunity that this crisis provides. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lovely. Who would have thought an economist could be so entertaining? Professor Stiglitz has kindly agreed to field some questions. And I know we've got a microphone set up here. Logistically, it's hard to take questions in this hall, but we're going to try some of it. So if you have a question, there's a microphone here. Please come up and ask it. We'll have time for 2 or 3.
Professor Luigi Palombi from Regulatory Institutions Network, the ANU. Some of the things you mentioned today brought to mind a favourite hobby horse of mine, gene patents. First you mentioned toxic assets. Well, gene patents, in my view, are a toxic asset that have been exploited very, very well from Silicon Valley for 20 years. The second thing you said was bad incentives create bad behaviour. And the patent system seems to be one of those that falls into that category. Now, recently you and Professor Sulston wrote a very good opinion piece against gene patents, and you criticised the theory or the argument that without the incentive that the patent system provides, there would be no investment in genetic research. And I was wondering if you would care to elaborate on that.
Well, yeah. For those of you who haven't been involved in this particular controversy, which is not really quite related to the global financial crisis, but is really a very important issue, intellectual property has taken on increasing importance. And the question then is, what are the rules for running an intellectual property regime? What is the role of the intellectual property regime within an innovation system? What is patentable and what is not? And intellectual property is man-made law. It's not natural law. It's a legal construct that we create, and it has costs and benefits. It restricts the use of knowledge. The defense of the restriction, knowledge is, to use an economic concept, knowledge is like a public good. If one person tells somebody else, I just told you a lot of things I know, I still know it, but you now know it, right? So it's not like a chair. If one person sits in a chair, another person can't sit in the chair. Knowledge is fundamentally different. A third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, put it much more poetically than an economist ever put it. He said, knowledge is like a candle. When one candle lights another, it doesn't diminish from the light of the first candle. And patents do that. They restrict the use of knowledge. The defense of the patents is that supposedly they provide greater incentives for innovation. But increasingly, we have become aware that poorly designed patent systems, and our patent system is poorly designed, can actually impede innovation. And there are a whole set of reasons why this is the case, that the most important input into knowledge is other knowledge, and it restricts the access to knowledge. There's a problem called the patent thicket, that every time somebody invents something, he discovers that some lawyer believes he's intruded on somebody else's patent, and it really stops research. So overall, our patent system is broken, dysfunctional. But the one area where patents are particularly, you might say, obnoxious, toxic, is in the area of genes. You may not know it, but some of you have genes that an American company has patented. The particular gene that was patented, two genes that were patented, that are very important, are two genes that are markers for breast cancer. If you have these two genes, the probability of having breast cancer is, I think, over 50%.
It's closer to 80%.
What?
Closer to 80%.
80%. So if you want to know whether you have those genes, relatively inexpensive to do the test, but Myriad, who owns your genes, says you have to pay it several $1,000s to do the test. The good news, I don't know if you know this, is that the American Civil Liberties Union decided that this was an issue of civil liberties. It was not just an economic issue, it was a basic human rights issue. And they sued, and I wrote a supporting economic opinion on that case on the side of ACLU, and it prevailed. So in the United States now, the law is that you cannot patent, that those patents were overruled. So it is a very important decision that going forward.
Thank you, Professor.
Professor Stiglitz, first of all, thank you very much for that very entertaining and informative lecture. I'm an undergraduate student of the university, so I hope you'll forgive any ignorance of economic principles that my question might reveal. But my question goes to the beginning of your lecture, where you mentioned that US house prices have fallen by about a third over the last couple of years. I know that many in this auditorium, when you said that, especially young people who are yet to own their first homes, were thinking, damn, if only that were the case in major Australian capital cities at the moment. So my question is, do you have any advice for policymakers in this country with a view to preventing the housing market from developing into a bubble, although some would say that it already is a bubble? And do you think that the Reserve Bank of Australia's interest rate policy in the recent past have put us in the right trajectory to doing so?
Yeah. Well, there are actually two parts to that. Trying to ascertain whether it's a bubble is not easy, but when I looked at the U.S., what was going on in the U.S., let me tell you why, and I don't know the Australian data so well, but let me tell you why I felt fairly confident in 2005 and 6 that we were developing a bubble, and it was, in retrospect, clear that it was the case. Housing prices were going up very rapidly, including for lower and middle income Americans. At the same time, incomes for most Americans were going down. Real incomes of most Americans have been falling for years. By 2007, before the crisis, incomes were below what they were in 1999. Now, after the crisis, they've fallen even more. But, and when I say this, this is most Americans. So a few people at the top have done well, and that's why GDP per capita has done well. But the vast majority of Americans have seen their income go down and down. And you don't have to have a PhD to figure out if incomes are going down and house prices are going up, you have a potential problem, particularly if interest rates start to rise, because then they won't be able to afford their homes. So it seemed to me, and if you look at the numbers historically, they were all out of proportion to what had happened historically. You looked at what was happening in the microeconomics, you could see that something very peculiar. You looked at what was happening to the structure of our economy. 3/4 of the growth, somewhere between 70-80% of our growth was related to real estate, either people taking money out of their homes or real estate investment, so we had a distorted economy. So there were lots of reasons to suspect something weird was going on. Now, the question is, what could they have done about this? And here, the Federal Reserve came back with a whole slew of bad arguments. One of them was that you can't be sure until after it breaks. Well, that's among the most foolish arguments, because all policy is done under uncertainty. So you could say we can't be sure, but we can be increasingly sure. The second argument that they gave, again a very silly argument, is interest rates are a blunt instrument, and therefore raising interest rates will have other adverse effects. The point is, regulators, central banks, have more than one instrument. The Congress gave the Federal Reserve powers over housing in 1994. What they could have done is raise the loan-to-value ratio. They could have lowered the income qualifications, or raised the income qualifications. There are a whole set of regulatory measures that they could have taken that would have dampened the bubble. And they could have done it gradually, and that would have brought housing prices down. And those are measures that could be taken in basically almost any economy.
Professor Stiglitz, one thing that you haven't mentioned in your talk is the other global crisis we're facing on climate change. And our recent recovery in Australia was due in part to our ability to continue selling coal and iron ore to China and Japan and others. And this growth strategy has not only is encouraged and supported by our political leaders. But I wanted to ask you, with your knowledge about what's going on in the broader climate change debates, will we be able to sell coal to China and to others in 10, 20, 30, 40 years, hence from now? And if not, will anyone else want to buy it? In other words, has our current answer of getting over our recent crisis just going to lead us to another one in the future?
Well, let me first answer the question more in a very broad way. I think, what has contributed to the crisis, one could say what led to the crisis, was a mispricing of risk, a mispricing of assets, of houses, real estate, and the sudden adjustment, the delayed adjustment of that, meant that eventually when the adjustment occurred, it was bigger, and because it was bigger, the impact on the economy has been the greater, and that has led to the magnitude of the economic problem in the United States and elsewhere. Well, the mispricing in natural resources is even larger. The mispricing in carbon. We don't know exactly what the right price of carbon is. Most people think it should be $60, $80 a ton. But what we do know is zero is the wrong price. And unless we give businesses some surety about what are the kinds of prices that they ought to be facing, they have no incentive either to economize in carbon or to innovate. So the first priority of any government ought to be to raise the price of carbon. Now, it actually makes sense, I think, for each country to do it on its own. And I've been an advocate. There are a number of ways of doing this. You could do it auctioning off emission rights. I'm more of an advocate of carbon taxes. I think the general principle that it's better to tax bad things than good things, it's better to tax pollution than working savings, means that because in the case of taxing bad things, you do two things. You get revenue and you discourage the bad activity. So it seems to me that the general principle seems a no-brainer. And if other countries don't do it, it still gives you a competitive advantage because you're not taxing good things, you're taxing bad things, and you're setting yourself up for the future, because in the future, I think it's very, very likely that there will be a high carbon price. And if you get used to a high carbon price now, you're in a competitive advantage relative to those, like those in the United States, that are delaying doing anything about it. So it seems to me that it's imperative. It's also, now I'm talking now about the United States, had we succeeded in getting a high carbon price in Copenhagen, it would have provided the basis of investment that would have been the basis of a revival of our economy. We can't go back to the kind of consumption that we had before the crisis, when our savings rate was zero. That was not sustainable. So what we really do need is to have an investment-led growth, but we can't have investment based on consumption because consumption is so weak. The whole world can't have it based on export because you can't, trade to Mars is still limited. So the whole world can't based on exports. The one basis for a global recovery, I think, is a high carbon price. And that would have both climate advantages and environmental advantages and economic advantages. Okay.
Thank you, Professor. Every time there is a financial economic crisis, and then these banks or financial institutions fail, one argument that these banks or the government always use to justify their bailout is that they are too big to fail. And it seems like this argument has been used all the time. And for myself, I feel like it's not so fair for normal people when these banks are so successful with their investment. They enjoy the fruits, they enjoy the big bonuses. But then they fail, we normal people have to use our tax money to help them. And I think that in the future, it's going to happen again, and this argument of too big to fail will be used again. So from your point of view, is there a way out? Is there a better policy? Or is there any way we can prevent this from happening again? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've been very critical of the bailout and of the regulatory reform in the United States, basically on those grounds. First, what we did in the United States is we didn't follow the ordinary rules of capitalism. A situation when people can't pay back what they owe is very common. You don't want it to happen to you, but it does happen, and that's why we have bankruptcy laws. And in a sense, we have laws for the banks that are very much like the ordinary bankruptcy laws with a couple differences. The most important difference is you don't want to wait until the bank is actually bankrupt before you shut it down. To put it in another way, when you put your ATM card into the you put your debit card into an ATM machine and it says insufficient funds, you want it to be because there's insufficient money in your account, not because the bank doesn't have any money. So the policy should be to shut down the bank before that happens, okay? And that we have laws that say that that's what you're supposed to happen. We have what we call capital adequacy requirements, prompt corrective action. We have a whole set of laws that do it. Unfortunately, in this crisis, as in many other crises, we suspend the rules, the laws, and effectively we suspend the rules of capitalism. What we did in this crisis is we socialized losses, at the same time we privatized gains. And when you have a system that has socializing losses and where you privatize gains, you distort incentives. You get what I call ersatz capitalism. It is not a market economy. It is a fake market economy. And its consequences are not only economic and social, but social. You undermine the social contract. It has effects on the people's view on the fairness of our economic system. It's even worse when the banks use the money that you use to pay out bonuses for record losses. People say, I understand theories of distribution that say if you work harder, you get more money, but I don't understand theories that say you make bigger losses, you get big rewards. And when they come up with clever ruses and say, oh, well, this is not a bonus for performance, this is a retention bonus, and your argument is, well, why are you retaining somebody who just made you a $1 trillion loss? And it is mysterious. Most people will get fired if they made losses like that. So all of this has been very bad for our social fabric. But we did even worse than this in this crisis. Not only do we bail out the banks and the bankers, we bailed out the shareholders and the bondholders. There was no reason we had to do that. Absolutely no reason. In the case of Continental Illinois, one of the largest banks in the United States that went bankrupt in the 1980s, we played by the rules of capitalism, and there was no problem. So we could have played by the rules of capitalism, but the big banks scared the Bush and Obama administrations. Well, what is the answer? Well, what did the regulatory bill that was just passed by Congress, we had a provision that called resolution authority that said, in the future, if this happens, we shouldn't let the big banks get away with it. But last time we had a similar law, we blinked. Next time, with this new law, we will blink. We will bail out the too big to fail banks. We will not let a Citibank, JP Morgan, we will not let these 6, 7 banks that are such a large fraction of the global marketplace fail. So we have done essentially nothing to prevent another kind of crisis. And because these banks know that they are too big to fail, they have a one-way bet. They know if they take a lot of risk and they win, they walk off with the profits. If they fail, the taxpayers pick up the losses. So we have not done anything about the incentives for excessive risk-taking. Now, in some countries, you have good bank supervisors that can monitor bank behavior. So the same policies that may be appropriate in one country may not be appropriate in another. But we know that we have the same regulator in place today that we had 5 years ago. Why should we have confidence in that regulator? In fact, we have every reason not to have confidence. And you look at what he supported in the context of the regulatory reform bill. Some of us were pushing for a regulation that would say that if you are one of these, if you are a bank with government insurance, you should not be allowed to gamble. You should not be allowed to write these credit default swaps, gambling on the death of some other bank. And the administration and the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board said, no, it is absolutely essential that our banks engage in gambling. They didn't use those words. The interesting thing is that the presidents of 2 of the regional Federal Reserve Board said, no, this is wrong. And they have been consistently saying there's only one way of dealing with too big to fail banks, and that is not allow them to get that big. Break them up. There is very little, in fact, as far as I know, almost no evidence of economies of scale and scope that justify the risk imposed on taxpayers, on our society, by these too big to fail banks, particularly in the context of a country where the regulatory structure has obviously demonstrated an inability to supervise this kind of excessive risk-taking. So the answer to your question is, yes, we know what to do, which is to break them up, restrict their activities. But unfortunately, they made very bad economic investments, as we saw in the crisis. They made very good political investments, and so far those political investments have been paying big dividends.
Thank you. If I can just ask your indulgence for another 2 or so minutes, I want to invite the President of the Economic Society of Australia, the group that's brought Professor Stiglitz out to Australia, just to say a quick thank you and to close proceedings for the oration. Professor Bruce Chapman.
I'm Bruce Chapman. I'm the President of the Economic Society of Australia. The goal of the Economic Society is the promotion and facilitation of public engagement on critical issues of economic importance. I can't think of a finer example than what has happened here today in that context. It's been nearly 2 years that we've been plotting and planning for events like today and for the last 3 weeks of Professor Stiglitz's tour. And I do thank PricewaterhouseCoopers, Qantas Airways, and also some who haven't been mentioned before, but absolutely critical, Corinne Kemp of DKC International and Anya Schriffen, Joseph Stiglitz's partner, who have been completely important to the arrangements and to the success of them. Generally, I think we think economists are kind of dull and miserable and technical. I mean, when was the last time you were planning a dinner party and said, we must have an economist here? That'll really set things off. And the trouble, of course, is that everything that economists do in public policy is extremely important. Everybody in this room is affected by any government policy change on tax or health insurance or in pensions. Just about anything you can think of that affects your welfare has government and economists engaged with it. And that's kind of a sad and disturbing but true thing. And from Professor Stiglitz's talk, you can see clearly that economists and economic policy advice and people engaged in economic regulation or not engaged in regulation can be a very important force for trouble. And we know that ignorant economic policy can have profoundly poor results. Thus the old joke that the difference between a psychiatrist and an economist is a psychiatrist only ruins one person at a time. Some economists, however, do things which are quite clearly, I think, very much for the public good. And it's been completely obvious to me today, and for those of you who have followed Professor Stiglitz's career, I advise you not to read his papers. It's impossible to read that many papers, even if you're very quick at it. His reputation with us in the discipline is about information areas, and there have been some extremely important concepts and notions that have come from his work, which appeals and is well understood within the discipline. Issues of asymmetric information, moral hazard and adverse selection. If you want to go to one of the 50 or so seminars for economists at the Australian National University every week, you can always impress by looking at an economic model and saying, well, yes, what about asymmetric information? Have you thought about adverse selection there? And was the moral hazard issues being engaged? These things, and I think that there's no greater testimony to Professor Stiglitz's profound influence in economics than what then that what before was undefined and confusing is now considered basic and obvious. And when I was studying economics, asymmetric information and moral hazard and all those things associated with were as basic to me and to my colleagues and my peers as downward sloping demand curves or the nature of public goods or externalities. These are profound contributions to the way we think about economics. To the rest of the world, though, Professor Stiglitz is engaged not just in the technical and defining the conceptual basis of economic theory, but in the biggest problems of our time, and this was pointed out also by Andrew McIntyre. And the problems today, I can't imagine there being a time when they seemed bigger. We seem to be in a circumstance in which most scientists agree that the planet is warming, that human activity has contributed to this, and that without changes the world will, to the behaviour and the economic engagement, the world will change irrevocably for the poorer. We seem to be in circumstances in which financial self-interest has the capacity to create such complexity that in conjunction with inadequate government regulation, this can lead to the precipice of economic meltdown. And that topic and that theme is one of the biggest themes of all in economic policy terms, that and climate change. Who has been the major contributor to this debate in a public policy context? It's Joseph Stiglitz. And he's shown us that today, that not only can he show us with great clarity the importance of it all, but he can undermine the idea that economists can be miserable and non-entertaining. And I guess if you are having that dinner party, you might revise the list to have an economist. And if my choice certainly would be Joseph Stiglitz. This has been a very fine day, I think, for public policy. When Professor Douglas Copeland founded the Economic Society in 1925, he promoted explicitly and very clearly and extolled the benefits of the use of economics to address practical problems. I think we've seen that writ large in the best possible example today. I want to say something personal about Joseph Stiglitz and the organisation of this tour. At the beginning he said that he wasn't interested in talking only to the Australian privileged elite. He wanted to be involved in environments like this one today, that's one provided by the Crawford School of Economics and Government, with large-scale attendance by the public, with significant engagement with the community, with access to citizens who care about and are directly affected by public policy. His contribution is also entwined heavily with a strong sense of democracy and the importance of accessibility and non-elitism. All of this, I think, has been achieved very much as we expected, far beyond mine. I didn't think it would be so funny, and I thank you so much, Professor Stiglitz. We're very much in your debt.
So before we say goodbye, just a quick mention that Professor Stiglitz will be signing his own book upstairs, and I think it's upstairs in the foyer for at least a brief period of time. The only thank you left is to thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.